She had, after all, precious little curiosity left for entertainment. But something in the old lawyer's phrase, "a boat with no water to float it," snagged at a memory so old and worn, smooth by grief that she could not quite place it.
What's wrong?
And so, more from habit of showing up wherever there was a crowd, and therefore work to be found, than any real hope, she walked the half-mile to the courthouse yard on a hot morning in the summer of 1888 with $14 sewn into her hem, and nothing else to lose. The wreck sat where it had sat for over 20 years, canted hard to one side in the cracked gray bed of what had once been the Widow's Fork River, its paddle wheel half buried in drifted sand, its pilot house windows long since shattered by when she was 44 years old, standing in the dust of a courthouse yard with $14 sewn into the hem of her only good skirt. And she had nowhere left in the world to sleep that night. Her name had been struck from the family ledger by her husband's own brother, a man named Cornelius Prout, who told the county clerk, in front of half the town, that a widow with no children and no blood claim had no right to the roof she had scrubbed and mended for 11 years. All she had was that hidden $14, a tin trunk of clothes, and a stubborn refusal to beg. So when the auctioneer, nearly laughing, offered up a rotting sternwheeler stranded 50 miles from the nearest drop of running water, marooned since the river itself had vanished, she raised her hand and bought it for $12 and a promise to haul away the wreck. Everyone in Furnace Creek Flats called it the most foolish purchase since the town's own founding. They did not know that sealed behind a swollen door in that dead ship's hold sat a secret that would explain why the river disappeared in the first place, and would put water back into 50 miles of thirsty earth. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh, if you have ever been told you were worth less than the ground you stood on. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Adeline Hargrove, for that was her name before she married, had been raised on moving water. Her father, Captain Silas Hargrove, had spent 30 years piloting freight and passengers up and down the Widow's Fork River, a muscular brown vein of water that once ran clear through the Arizona Territory from the high pine country down through the cottonwood bottoms of Furnace Creek Flats and onward toward the distant railhead at Coben's Junction. Addie's earliest memories were not of solid ground at all, but of the low thrum of a steam engine beneath her bare feet, the smell of pitch and coal smoke, and her father's enormous laughing voice calling out soundings to the deckhands as the boat threaded the shallows. He was a broad, sunburned man who believed, with the plain faith of a river pilot, that water belonged to everyone who needed it, and that a man's worth was measured by what he was willing to carry for others who could not carry it themselves. He taught her to read a current the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, pointing out the boils and the seams and the quiet places where the river hid its danger beneath a smooth and friendly face. She learned, too, to mend canvas, to splice rope, to keep a ledger of cargo down to the last pound of flour, because her father did not believe idle hands suited a captain's daughter, whatever her sex. It's who's watching the water, girl, he used to tell her, not who owns the banks. And she would carry that particular saying with her, tucked away like a keepsake, through every hardship that came after. From her mother, a quiet seamstress named Ruth, who had come west from Missouri with a trunk of fabric and a spine of iron, Addie learned patience and the particular dignity of making something whole again with careful, unhurried stitches, a lesson that would matter more than she could have known. Ruth took in mending and altering for half the families along the river landings, and Addie spent countless afternoons at her mother's knee learning to turn a worn collar, to darn a hole so fine it disappeared entirely, to see in a torn and discarded garment not waste but simply work not yet done. Neither of her parents ever spoke of wealth as a thing to be hoarded. Her father often said that a river which stopped moving went stagnant and foul, and that money and kindness both worked the same way, and needed always to keep flowing toward whoever needed them next. It was a philosophy that made the Hargroves respected, but never rich. And Addie grew up believing without question that this was simply how a decent life was built. One steady plank at a time, with no shortcuts and no complaints. She remembered, too, long evenings tied up at the Furnace Creek landing, when farmers and freighters alike would gather on the deck of the Osprey's Grace to trade news and gossip while her father settled accounts by lantern light. And how he always seemed to know which family had had a hard season and quietly adjusted his fares before anyone had to ask. A kindness he never spoke of and never expected thanked. She was 9 years old the year the river simply stopped. She remembered the morning clearly even decades later, the low gray light, the strange silence where the current's murmur should have been, and her father standing on the bank with his hat in his hands, staring upstream toward a place called Cutter's Gap, as though the water itself had personally betrayed him. Within a season, the townsfolk of Furnace Creek Flats were hauling water in barrels from wells that soon ran low themselves. Farms withered. The freight business her father had built his whole life around dried up as surely as the riverbed. And Silas Hargrove, after months of writing letters to the territorial governor and riding alone up toward the gap to see for himself what had become of the water, simply did not come home one autumn evening. No body was found. No explanation was ever offered that satisfied Ruth, who spent the rest of her short life insisting quietly, to anyone who would listen, that her husband had not drowned in a river that no longer existed and had not simply wandered off, but had discovered something up at that dam that certain powerful men did not want spoken of. She died when Addie was 17, of what the doctor called a weakened heart, though Addie always believed grief alone had done the greater share of the work. Left alone, Addie had married Thomas Marsh 2 years later, a good-natured rancher's son with a gentle laugh and a family. The Marshes, who ran cattle on land bordering the very Prout family that had, decades before, built that dam at Cutter's Gap and turned the diverted river into a private irrigation canal serving their own bottomland. Thomas never spoke much of his family's old business dealings, and Addie, still raw from her own losses, never pressed him. She simply gave herself over to 11 years of steady, unglamorous devotion, nursing his father through a long illness, keeping the household books straighter than any bank ledger, mending fences and harness and the family's threadbare fortunes with the same patient stitches her mother had taught her. She believed, as her father once had, that decency compounded like interest, that a person's worth showed itself over years, not in a single transaction. She had no notion that a boat rotting 50 miles from water, and a secret buried behind Cutter's Gap, would one day rise up out of her own past to prove her right. Thomas Marsh died of a fever in the spring of 1886, leaving no children and, as Addie would soon discover, no will that anyone troubled themselves to honor. His brother Cornelius, older by 6 years and long jealous of the affection their father had shown his gentler sibling, wasted no time. Within a month of the burial he arrived at the ranch house with the county clerk in tow and a stack of papers he claimed proved the land had always belonged to the Marsh estate entire, with no separate portion set aside for a widow who, in his words spoken loudly enough for the hired hands to hear, had brought nothing to the marriage but her sewing basket. Addie fought it as best she could, riding into Furnace Creek Flats to consult the one lawyer the town could boast, a tired, honest man named Whitfield Combs, who told her plainly that the territory's laws, and the judge who enforced them, tended to side with whichever brother held the deed and the louder voice. Cornelius did not merely want the land. He wanted, it seemed to Addie, to erase every trace that she had ever belonged to it. He had the hired hands move her mother's old rocking chair to the barn before she had even finished packing. And he sold, without asking, 2 milk cows she had raised from calves, telling the buyer plainly that a widow moving to town had no need of livestock. Addie bit back every word she wanted to say. remembering her mother's old lesson that a person's dignity was not a thing another could take, unless she handed it over herself. And within the year, she found herself packing the same tin trunk her mother had carried west, walking off land she had tended for over a decade with nothing to show for it but calloused hands and an unbroken back. She took work where she could, mending linens for the hotel in town, taking in wash, sitting up nights with the sick for whatever coins a grateful family could spare, and she watched, with a strange numb clarity, as the $14 she managed to save became not a fortune, but simply the last soft border between herself and true destitution. The town, for its part, treated her with the particular pity reserved for women who have fallen from a respectable house into common labor. Shopkeepers were kind enough but careful, as though misfortune might be catching, and more than one former friend crossed the street, rather than have to find words for how much Addie's circumstances had changed. Only Whitfield Combs, and a handful of the older families who remembered her father's steady kindness on the river, still greeted her plainly, by name, without the small hesitation she had come to expect from everyone else. It was Whitfield Combs, oddly enough, who mentioned the courthouse auction to her almost as an afterthought one afternoon, telling her the county was finally disposing of some old derelict property abandoned since the river dried. If she wanted to come along and see the spectacle, since half the town intended to attend for the entertainment of watching some fool bid on a boat with no water to float it, Addie very nearly did not go. And boys with slingshots, its once white hull gone the color of old bone under decades of relentless sun. Someone, long ago, had painted its name along the bow in tall black letters, and though the paint had faded to a ghost of itself, Addie could still make it out when the auctioneer's assistant walked, the small gathered crowd out to view the lot before bidding began. The Osprey's Grace. She stood very still when she read it, feeling something turn over slowly in her chest, though she told herself firmly that riverboats were common enough once, and that Osprey's Grace was hardly an uncommon sort of name for a vessel, and that grief made a woman see her dead father in every shadow if she let it. The auctioneer, a portly sweating man named Duggan, who clearly relished the joke of it, announced the boat as scrap and salvage only, 50 miles from the nearest navigable water, good for lumber and little else, and invited bids starting at $5, more to satisfy the county's paperwork than any real expectation of a sale. Cornelius Prout, for the Prout and Marsh families moved in the same small circle of prosperous men, and he had come to watch the sport along with everyone else, laughed loudly enough that Addie heard him clear across the yard, remarking to his companions that only a truly desperate woman would throw good money after a dead boat in a dead river. It was, perhaps, precisely that laugh, and the particular cruelty of being watched and mocked once more by the man who had already taken everything else from her, that put Addie's hand into the air before her good sense could stop it. $10, she called out, and then, when Duggan blinked in surprise and Cornelius's laughter faltered, 12. No one else bid. The gavel came down, and Addie Marsh, penniless widow, found herself the sole and legal owner of a rotting steamship stranded 50 miles from any water at all, with $2 left to her name and the whole town. Save perhaps old Whitfield Combs, certain she had finally lost her mind. She walked the 5 miles out to the wreck alone the following morning, telling herself she meant only to assess what lumber might be salvaged and sold, carrying with her only a canteen of water, a fence post lever, and the same dogged practicality that had carried her through 11 years of a hard marriage and 2 more of harder widowhood. The walk itself took her through country she barely recognized as the lush river bottom of her girlhood. Cracked flats where cottonwoods had once shaded the banks now standing gray and skeletal. The whole valley bleached the color of an old bone left too long in the sun. And by the time the wreck's dark silhouette rose up out of the heat shimmer ahead of her, she felt less like a woman inspecting salvage and more like a mourner walking toward a grave she had somehow never visited. Up close, the boat was larger than she remembered any rivercraft being. Its paddle wheel taller than a man, its hull scored and pitted by decades of blowing sand. And yet something in its proportions, in the particular slope of its bow, tugged at her with a familiarity she could not place until she climbed the warped gangplank and stood on the tilted deck. Running her palm along a railing worn smooth by hands, she could almost feel beneath her own that she noticed the door to the captain's cabin, swollen shut with 20 years of desert heat and old rain, bore a brass plate, green with age, engraved simply with the initials S.H. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a fence post lever and the flat of a rusted hatchet she found in the hold, to force the swollen cabin door from its frame. And when it finally gave way with a groan, like something long asleep being woken against its will, the air that rolled out to meet her was cool and strangely undisturbed, thick with the smell of old paper and cedar and something faintly like her father's pipe tobacco. Though that, she told herself, was surely only memory playing tricks in the heat. Inside, remarkably preserved by the tight seal of the swollen door and the dry desert air, she found a small cabin exactly as its captain must have left it on whatever last morning he walked away from it, a narrow bunk still made, a shaving mirror gone spotted with age, a logbook chained to the writing desk, and a heavy iron strongbox bolted beneath the bunk that took her another hour of prying to open. The logbook, when she finally sat with trembling hands to read it by the light let in through the broken window, was written in a broad looping hand she had not seen in 20 years, but would have known blindfolded, having watched it fill 100 ledgers of her childhood, her father's. The final entries, dated across the last weeks before the river vanished, described in increasingly urgent language a series of letters Silas Hargrove had sent to the territorial governor's office regarding what he called the illegal closure of the public sluice gates at Cutter's Gap, gates that had, by the original territorial water charter of 1861, been required by law to remain open to all downstream users, farmers and freight boats alike. He wrote of a man named Eli Prout, Cornelius's own father, who had, together with 2 hired engineers, quietly rebuilt the sluice into a private dam over the course of a single dry season, diverting the entire flow of the Widow's Fork into a canal serving only Prout land, and who had, when confronted, offered Silas first a bribe and then, in increasingly plain language, a threat. The very last entry, dated the night before the river stopped running for good, reads simply, "I have the charter itself, the original copied and witnessed, and copies of Eli Prout's own letters admitting what he has done. I mean to carry them to the governor myself, whatever it costs me. If anything should happen to me, look first in the strongbox, and know that your mother and Adeline were the truest current I ever piloted." Beneath the oilcloth packet, wrapped separately in a square of faded blue calico that Addie recognized, with a start that stole the breath clean out of her, as a scrap of her own mother's dressmaking fabric, she found a single folded photograph, brown and curling at the edges, of herself as a small girl standing on the deck of this very boat between her father's knees, her mother beside them, both with her hand shading her eyes against the sun. On the back, in Silas Hargrove's familiar hand, was written only a date, 3 days before the last logbook entry, and the words, "For when you are old enough to need it." She sat with that photograph a long while before she could bring herself to set it aside and read further. And it was only then that she noticed a second, thinner letter tucked into the logbook's back cover, addressed not to the governor or to any official, but simply to Ruth, in which Silas confessed his fear plainly, writing that Eli Prout had grown desperate enough to threaten worse than bribery, and that if the letter ever reached her, it would mean he had not made it safely to the capital, and asking her to see that Adeline was raised knowing the river belonged to everyone, whatever became of the man who had tried to claim it for himself. sitting alone in that dead captain's cabin with the ghost of her father's handwriting in her lap, and her own small solemn face looking up at her from a photograph 20 years buried in a dead man's strongbox. Addie Marsh finally understood, with a grief so old it had gone quiet and a fury so new it burned bright and clean, that the wreck she had bought as a joke, a fool's last $12, was in fact the very ship her father had vanished from, and that she now held in her own two hands the proof of exactly why the river she had grown up on, and the town she had grown old in, had gone dry. She did not sleep that night, and by the gray hour before dawn she had made her decision, though she understood well enough what it would cost her to carry it out. The charter and the letters were, on their own, only paper, powerful paper, but paper that a man like Cornelius Prout, who had inherited not only his father's land, but his father's instinct for controlling a room, could easily dismiss as a grieving widow's forgery or a dead man's fantasy, unless she could bring them before someone with the authority and the will to act. She spent her last $2 on the trip into the territorial capital at Prescott, riding the stage 3 long days with the oilcloth packet sewn into the lining of her trunk beside her mother's old sewing basket, and presented herself, dust-covered and plain-spoken, at the land office of a young assistant to the territorial water commissioner named Everett Doss, a careful, patient man who had, as it happened, spent 2 frustrating years investigating persistent rumors that the widow's, Fork's mysterious disappearance had never been entirely natural. He read the charter twice, examined Eli Prout's confessional letters with a magnifying glass and a low whistle, and told Addie plainly that if the documents proved authentic under examination, which he had every confidence they would, the Prout family's private dam at Cutter's Gap stood in direct and provable violation of territorial law, and could be ordered open by court decree within the season. Word of Addie's journey reached Furnace Creek Flats before she did, carried by a stage driver who had overheard enough of Doss's excited conversation to spread the story through every saloon and store along the route home. And by the time Addie stepped down from the coach, she found herself, for the first time in 2 years, the subject of hopeful gossip rather than pity. Cornelius Prout, predictably, did not take the news quietly. He rode into town the following week with 2 hired lawyers of his own and made a great public show of denouncing Addie as a bitter, penniless woman inventing lies against a respected family out of spite for a legal inheritance dispute long since settled. And he pressed Whitfield Combs and the county judge alike to have the matter dismissed before the water commissioner's investigation could even properly begin. For a tense fortnight, it seemed entirely possible that Prout money and Prout influence would smother the truth exactly as thoroughly as they had smothered it 20 years before. And Addie, watching her hard-won hope curdle under the weight of Cornelius's threats, for he did threaten her, cornering her outside the mercantile to promise quietly that she would regret dragging his family's name through the mud, that she had no husband and no protector left to shield her from what a man in his position could do to a woman alone, began to feel the old despair creeping back in. The sense that the world simply belonged to whoever shouted loudest and owned the most land, whatever the paper said. She lay awake more than one night in the small rented room above the mercantile, turning her father's logbook over in her lap by candlelight, wondering whether she had only succeeded in dragging up an old grief to be buried a second time, this time with her own reputation alongside it. But then she would read again the line he had written to her without knowing it, about her being the truest current he had ever piloted, and something in her would steady itself the way a boat steadies once it finds the channel beneath a rough surface. It was Ruth's old patience and Silas's old stubbornness, both, that kept her from folding. She wrote a plain, careful letter of her own to every farmer and rancher whose land had once bordered the living river, inviting them to a meeting at the schoolhouse to hear, in her own words and with the documents laid open on the table before them, exactly what had been done to their water and their livelihoods a generation ago. And to her quiet astonishment, nearly 40 families came, arriving in wagons and on horseback and on foot from farms she had not seen in years, many of them carrying their own small memories of the year the water stopped. Memories they had never before had cause or courage to speak aloud in a single room together. The meeting at the Furnace Creek Schoolhouse on a hot September evening in 1888 would be spoken of in the Valley for years afterward as the night the truth finally outweighed the fear. Addie stood before neighbors who had known her only as the widow turned out by her own husband's family, and read Eli Pruitt's confession aloud in a voice that shook only slightly, laid the 1861 charter flat upon the schoolmaster's desk for any man or woman present to examine, and told them plainly that the dry wells, the withered orchards, the failed freight line that had once employed half the men in the room, all traced back to a single dry season when one family had quietly decided the river belonged to them alone. She did not ask for pity, and she did not ask for revenge. She asked only that the assembled families sign their names to a petition, demanding the territorial commissioner enforce the public charter and order the sluice gates at Cutter's Gap reopened. Cornelius Pruitt arrived partway through, having heard of the gathering, and attempted from the back of the room to shout the proceedings down as slander, but found to his evident shock that the very neighbors he had counted on to defer to his family standing had instead grown very quiet and very cold toward him, several rising to add their own long-buried memories of his father's arrogance in those final dry weeks before the river stopped. Within days the petition, backed now by Commissioner Doss's own findings and the weight of 40 signatures, forced the territorial court's hand, and a formal order was issued directing the immediate and permanent reopening of the sluice gates, the dismantling of the private canal works, and the restoration of the Widow's Fork to public trust, exactly as the original charter demanded. Cornelius Pruitt, facing not only legal judgment, but the far heavier judgment of neighbors who no longer trusted his word or feared his name, quietly withdrew his own earlier claim against Thomas Marsh's estate rather than risk further scrutiny of his family's affairs. And within a year he had sold off the bulk of the Pruitt landholdings and left the territory altogether. His fortune and his father's legacy both diminished to something considerably smaller than the fear it had once commanded. Addie stood at Cutter's Gap itself on the morning the gates were finally winched open after 21 years, watching alongside Commissioner Doss and half the town as the first low rush of water came pouring back down the long dry channel, dark and glinting and impossibly loud after 2 decades of silence, soaking into cracked earth that had almost forgotten what rain even meant. And she found herself weeping without shame, for her father and her mother both, and for every family in the valley who had suffered quietly for the sin of one man's greed. Children who had never once seen the Widow's Fork running ran alongside its edge shouting as though a parade had come to town. Farmers knelt to touch the water with their bare hands, and old men who remembered the river from their own boyhood stood very still with their hats off, saying nothing at all because there was nothing adequate to say. Someone had brought a fiddle, and by nightfall there was dancing on the schoolhouse green. And more than one neighbor came to find Addie in the crowd simply to take her hand and hold it a moment, an acknowledgment plainer and more honest than any speech could have offered. The Osprey's grace never sailed again, of course. 20 years of desert sun had done too thorough a job on her hull for that. But Addie, using a portion of the 22 gold double eagles her father had left sealed in that strongbox, paid to have the old steamship hauled the last stretch to the riverbank once the water returned. And there she had it set permanently on a cradle of stone, not as a wreck any longer, but as a monument. Its cabin restored, its brass plate polished bright, opened each season to any traveler or schoolchild who wished to read, painted now in careful letters along its inner wall, the story of the charter of 1861 and the river that had been stolen and returned. The remaining gold, along with money raised gratefully by farmers whose orchards bloomed again for the first time in a generation, went toward rebuilding the town well and a modest public ferry landing, so that no single family could ever again claim to own what belonged to everyone. Whitfield Combs, moved by the whole affair, helped Addie draw up her own clear legal claim to a small parcel along the restored riverbank. Land enough for a house and a garden, purchased honestly and held in her name alone, so that never again would she stand at the mercy of a brother-in-law's signature or a clerk's convenience. She planted cottonwoods along the bank that first autumn, small and spindly things scarcely taller than a fence post, and told anyone who asked that she did not expect to sit in their shade herself, only that some child not yet born deserved to grow up beside a river that ran the whole year through, the way she once had. We began this story by telling you that Adeline Marsh was 44 years old, cast out and penniless, and that she spent her last $12 on a boat that could not float, sitting 50 miles from water in a dead riverbed that half a town had long since stopped hoping would ever run again. We told you it looked, to every eye but her own, like the most foolish purchase a desperate woman could make. But we also promised you that what lay sealed inside that hull would change her life and restore an entire community. And now you know the whole of it, that the wreck was her own father's lost ship, that the secret behind its swollen cabin door was a stolen river and a stolen truth 20 years buried, and that the woman everyone in Furnace Creek Flats had written off as ruined turned out to be the only one among them still carrying, in her own steady hands, exactly what was needed to set things right. Adeline never sought Cornelius Prute's ruin, only the water that was rightfully her neighbor's, and in the plain justice of the territorial court and the quiet withdrawal of a man who could no longer meet his neighbor's eyes, she found something far more lasting than revenge. She proved, as her father always believed, that worth is not measured by the deed to the land a person stands on, but by what they are willing to carry for others who cannot carry it themselves. The Osprey's grace, once mocked as the most foolish $12 ever spent in the history of Furnace Creek Flats, became instead the truest bargain the town had ever seen. Because what Addie had actually purchased that hot summer morning was never really a wreck at all, but the last unfinished piece of her own father's unfinished journey, waiting patiently in the dust for someone with his same stubborn faith in flowing water to come and carry it the rest of the way home. Thank you, truly, for spending this quiet hour with Adeline Marsh and the river that came home to Furnace Creek Flats after 21 silent years. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks abandoned is not always worthless. And before you go, we'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.